Hello, Michael, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for this.
My pleasure.
Okay, let's start. So, how old were you during this whole period of Vietnam War?
I actually was drafted at age 20, and I turned 21 in basic training, which was in Fort Lewis up in Washington.
How was your experience in the armed forces?
Well, I was drafted after spending a year or so traveling in England, Scotland, France, and Spain, because I wasn't as sure what I wanted to do after graduating from high school. It wasn't long after I got home that I got my draft notice. We immigrated, my family and I immigrated to the U.S. in 1962 when I was in ninth grade. So I thought of going back to Canada, but I loved living in the U.S. And so I just made the decision that I'll go into the Army and serve my time and hope for the best. It was done with a lot of discussion, though, because my father had been a Second World War vet. He went over to Europe in 1939 with the 1st Canadian Division, and he came back at the end of the war in 1945 with my mother, who was a Londoner. She was a war bride. And my father had a pretty rough time of it in Europe during the war, and he certainly didn't want to see me go off to war. The country was in turmoil. There was a lot going on during the 60s. It was a very turbulent time, politically, socially, and the Vietnam War certainly contributed to that turbulence in a significant way.
We've been learning a lot about this, and it's nice to have someone who has seen all of this instead of just reading about it secondhand through textbooks. So how much did civilian life change during the Vietnam War?
The country was very divided, very, very divided. And there were Americans who were volunteering and going to Vietnam and felt strongly that it was the right thing to do, and there were Americans that were going to Canada. But huge impact on families, any family that had a draft age young man. In my case, I was drafted. And the women were not subject to the draft. Women did serve in Vietnam. There were nurses there. There were women who were going over and volunteering in different ways. But in terms of the impact on the nation itself, other than watching Walter Cronkite or Eric Sevareid in the evening news and the coverage, the film footage that would come in on the nightly news, and it was pretty graphic, and it didn't portray what was going on, in my opinion, unfairly. It just covered war, and war is miserable. The impact on America really didn't change. It didn't change people's lifestyle or economics. It didn't change the way they went about their daily life. And the reason why was because the war was so many miles away. We didn't see it, we didn't smell it, we didn't hear it.
The big one, what were your views on the Vietnam War itself?
Well, I remember in high school, I participated in demonstrations against the war. I graduated from high school in 1966, and I remember participating in demonstrations in San Francisco. There were thousands of people that turned out for those marches. I was opposed to the war, but at the same time, we kept on getting, and the media covered this quite a bit, very different sets of facts being released by the military itself, which was under the command primarily of General Westmoreland. Constant debates, both written and oral debates that you could either read or listen to, that would give you different facts about what was actually going on in Vietnam. There were a lot of different things, bits of information. There was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which turned out to be, at least by some historians, a false story. One of the things that happened out of the war, I think, was a growing mistrust not only of the military, but a growing mistrust of government itself, of our politicians. I don't think the average American really felt, unless they were directly involved, a family member was involved, I don't think they felt really any impact of the war at all. It wasn't like the Second World War, for example, where we had a clear enemy who we really had a fairly good understanding of why we were sending men off to war. I don't think we ever really clearly established a solid reason other than the fear of communism to go off to war. And there are a lot of similarities between what we did in Vietnam and what we've done in Iraq. We didn't understand the culture, we didn't understand the history, the people, the religions, and we've unfortunately repeated some history which I think more and more in retrospect we'll realize we made some very serious mistakes. And after I got out of the Army, I just quietly kind of slipped back into the American way of life. Eventually, in 1972, I became employed with the San Francisco Police Department, where I worked for 31 years. During the war, we had the Kennedy assassination, we had Martin Luther King assassinated, there were other very high-profile killings, and there was increasing criticism of the military leadership and of the political leadership. The Vietnam War to this day has left a very bitter taste in their mouth. So there were problems that servicemen brought home. Post-traumatic stress syndrome was not really a topic of discussion, but I know servicemen struggled, just like they've struggled coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan. And the military is doing a much, much better job of dealing with that now than they did in those days. In those days, it wasn't part of the agenda, really. So the Vietnam, I did not go to Vietnam. I served. I had a tough time in the military, though, because I was stationed in Fort MacArthur, and so it was a crazy time, crazy period in my life.
That's it. Thank you very much for being part of this interview.
Sure.
I'm sure I'm going to get an A on this.